It began on an overcast morning in the village of Kingsbridge Hollow, the sort of damp and grey day when shadows blur and nothing seems quite where it should be. The villagers were used to gossip and peculiarities, but even the most avid whisperers fell silent when Henry Darcy strolled through the gate of Primrose Cottage, a man thought to be long dead. Henry Darcy had disappeared 3 years ago without a trace, presumed drowned after his boat was found shattered on the rocks off the Devon coast. A solemn funeral had followed, a widow had grieved, and the world had moved on. But now he stood on his own doorstep, older, a little thinner, but unmistakably himself, except for one curious detail. As the sun broke briefly through the clouds, bathing the garden path in fractured light, someone noticed it. He cast no shadow. At first, people dismissed it as a trick of the light or overactive imaginations, but as more eyes turned toward him, unease spread like smoke. Henry Darcy smiled politely at neighbours he no longer recognised, asked after people who had since moved or passed on, and embraced his wife, Eleanor, who fainted in his arms. Doctor. Penrose, called to examine Eleanor, later claimed that the man's skin was cold to the touch. Not icy, just curiously lacking warmth. And when asked about the past 3 years, Henry offered nothing but vague recollections: a shipwreck, an island, a rescue, a long recovery. No names, no dates, nothing verifiable. Yet his manner was calm, even charming. He had Henry's voice, Henry's gait, Henry's odd little mole on his right earlobe. His clothes were new, but worn oddly, belt buckled 1 notch too tight, shoes half a size too small, as if he were playing a role just slightly off. The matter might have drifted into whispers and speculation had it not been for the body discovered. 2 days later, Mavis Gilbert, a part-time housemaid at Primrose Cottage, failed to arrive for work. Her bicycle was found neatly propped against the hedge, but there was no sign of her. A search was organised, and by midday, her body was found in the potting shed behind the cottage. Her neck had been snapped, her hands neatly folded across her chest. No sign of a struggle, no defensive wounds, no fingerprints except her own. Inspector Cray from the county was called in. He found the scene unnerving. The shed had been locked from the inside. The key lay on the ground beside Mavis, but the door and windows were bolted. A single footprint in the damp soil outside the door belonged to Henry's boots, confirmed by the muddy pair he'd left near the kitchen. Cray asked Henry to explain his whereabouts the night before. Henry said he had been in bed with Eleanor, and she, still pale and visibly shaken, confirmed it. The inspector couldn't place him at the scene, couldn't find any weapon or motive, yet the image of a locked shed, a broken neck and a missing shadow clung like a fog. It was Reverend Mortimer who telephoned Miss Marple. He had once heard her speak at a women's gathering in Chipping Cleghorn, and had never forgotten her keen eyes and soft-spoken questions. He didn't believe in ghosts, but something here, he said, was wrong. When Miss Marple arrived, dressed, modestly and carrying a small notebook, the village exhaled. She listened carefully to the facts, visited the cottage, the shed, and the vicarage where the village was buzzing. She asked about Mavis. The girl had no enemies, no debts, and no history of trouble. She was quiet, punctual, and slightly superstitious. Miss Marple stood for some time near the shed, examining the locks, the hinges, and the tiny window with its webbed glass. Then she asked to see Henry's clothes. Eleanor, still distant, obliged. Inside, the wardrobe. Miss Marple examined the shoes. polished, yet slightly scuffed at the toe. She picked up the belt, measured the notches, and finally opened the drawer with Henry's folded shirts. She paused. One shirt had the wrong initials stitched. Inside HL, not HD, she asked Eleanor about it. Eleanor said the shirt must have been bought second-hand, perhaps from the recovery centre where Henry had stayed. She didn't question it. She had been too relieved, or too afraid. Miss Marple asked to speak with Henry. He welcomed her in the drawing room with a steady smile and offered her tea. She declined. She asked him about his rescue, about his past. He repeated the vague story, this time adding a name. John, he said, a fisherman. No surname, no village. Miss Marple asked about Mavis. Henry claimed not to know her well. She came in the mornings. She was pleasant, polite, nothing more. As she left, Miss Marple asked just one more question, whether he was right or left-handed. Henry hesitated. Left, he said. Curious, thought Miss Marple. The tea set in the room had all been arranged for a right-handed person. The milk jug to the right, the spoon on the right, the cup handle turned right. Not decisive, but odd. The next morning, she returned to the shed. This time she asked the inspector for a reenactment. Could someone lock the door from inside, snap a neck and arrange the body neatly, all without noise? It seemed implausible. The ground outside told a different story. No scuffle, just that one footprint, and something else. A tiny smear of oil on the latch. Miss Marple turned to the tools. One was missing, an old gardening hook. Later found beneath the floorboards, wiped clean, except for a small strand of fabric caught in the joint. Fabric from Mavis's uniform. When Miss Marple confronted Eleanor quietly that evening, the widow didn't deny it. She had found the real Henry's body buried beneath the cottage weeks ago, murdered and hidden by the man who now wore his face. She had said nothing out of fear and grief, and when Mavis discovered the shirt with the wrong initials, she knew Mavis would go to the police. The man, whoever he was, had no shadow because he wasn't Henry. He had mimicked him, studied him, worn him like a mask. But he had overlooked the smallest things, like which side of the cup to place the spoon on, like how Henry always hummed when nervous, and this man never had, or the fact that the belt was too tight. Miss Marple said nothing of her suspicions yet. She merely looked at the sky, where the clouds had thickened again. No sun now, no shadows, only silence and a growing chill. The crime had begun with a man returning from the dead, and ended with the terrifying realization that he never should have returned at all. Miss Marple did not return to London after her initial visit. She told Reverend Mortimer she'd found the air in Kingsbridge Hollow rather agreeable and had decided to stay a few days at the Rosewood Inn. She said it cheerfully, of course, but the Reverend sensed a firmness behind the words and informed Inspector Cray without delay. Cray, though sceptical of the elderly spinster's reputation, had the good sense to keep his pride tucked away. After all, something about the Dorsey case refused to settle in his mind. It wasn't just the impossible return or the untraceable past. It was the way people behaved, just a little too cautiously, as if the village itself had swallowed something it couldn't quite digest. Miss Marple's presence at Primrose Cottage the next morning was met with mixed emotions. Eleanor, composed yet faintly brittle, offered tea again. She'd grown colder since the previous conversation, but polite. Henry, or the man claiming to be Henry, greeted her with a level of courtesy that bordered on performance. His eyes watched her more closely than before, as if trying to determine how much she had seen beneath the surface. Miss Marple asked to see the shed again, claiming curiosity about gardening practices. Henry chuckled and offered to walk her. There himself, his gait steady, his posture almost too perfect. The shed hadn't changed, but Miss Marple brought with her a small silver compact, ostensibly to check her hair. When Henry turned to examine the flower beds, she quickly used it to catch the angle of the morning light. It was faint, but unmistakable. He cast a shadow now. Faint, watery, barely clinging to his form, but present. That difference alone struck her deeply. Shadows don't come and go, she thought. People might stand in darkness or move in bright light, but a shadow's presence isn't optional. Later, as she wandered back through the garden alone, she noticed a garden gnome by the path, oddly placed. It was facing away from the walkway, as though someone had moved it in haste. Bending slowly, she picked it up and turned it over. A small tuft of what looked like black dog hair clung to the base. That in itself wasn't so unusual, except that the Dorseys had never owned a dog, and Eleanor, when asked, denied any such pet now or in the past. Miss Marple did not press. She merely nodded and slipped the gnome back where it had been. That afternoon she walked into the village and visited the general store. She inquired in her gentle, unhurried way about new visitors to the village, anyone arriving recently, anyone who might have passed unnoticed. Mrs. Fetcher behind the counter thought hard and recalled a man who'd stayed briefly at the inn under the name Lawrence Hill. He had a northern accent, she thought, and asked a lot of questions about local families. He'd left a week before Henry Dorsey reappeared. Miss Marple made a soft noise of understanding and moved on to the inn. There, after tea with the manager, she asked to see the ledger. The name Lawrence Hill was there, in a hurried hand, but what caught her attention was the name 2 lines below it, G. Latham. George Latham had been a schoolmate of Henry Dorsey's, and according to village gossip had drowned on the same fishing trip where Henry had disappeared. His body, however, was recovered. If this man had signed in as Latham after Latham's funeral, then either it was a cruel joke, or someone had borrowed the identity carelessly. Returning to Primrose Cottage at dusk, Miss Marple requested to speak with Henry alone. Eleanor, startled but not objecting, remained in the drawing-room, while Miss Marple led the man to the back garden, where the gnome had been. She pointed to it. "You know," she said softly, "the soil here doesn't match. The ground around it is drier than the rest. It looks like someone dug here not long ago and tried to hide the disturbance. That's quite a thing to forget, especially for a gardener." Henry's expression remained neutral. He said, "I wouldn't know. I've only been home a short while." But his gaze flicked just briefly to the hedge that bordered the property. That flicker was enough. Miss Marple, with her eye trained by years of village observation, recognized it as the sort of glance one gives when confirming whether something buried is still undisturbed. That night, she stayed up late in her room at the Rosewood Inn, thinking. She wrote notes carefully in her journal. Wrong initials on shirt, incorrect belt size, inconsistent memory, lack of shadow, return of shadow. Dog hair, garden gnome, false names in ledger, a pattern of careful construction and small errors. But still, nothing definitive, no motive. No proof, just impressions and intuition. The next morning she returned once more to Primrose Cottage, this time requesting a tour of the attic. Eleanor, hesitant, led her up with keys that jingled far too much for such a small house. The attic was dusty but oddly well swept in one corner. There was a trunk there, old wooden and cracked along one edge. Miss Marple opened it with effort and found old clothes, a faded photograph of the real Henry and Eleanor, and something far more troubling, a bundle of letters signed H.D., but in two different handwriting styles, one rounded, fluid, one sharp and angular. The newer letters, those supposedly written during his recovery, were in the second style. Miss Marple took one, folded it carefully, and looked at Eleanor. "You read these?" she asked quietly. Eleanor nodded. "And you didn't notice the difference in tone?" Eleanor's voice trembled for the first time. "I did," she whispered, "but I told myself grief changes people." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "Yes, but not how they write. Not how they tie their shoes. Not how they hold their cup." When she left the house, she passed Inspector Cray on the lane. She paused beside him and said, "There's a man inside who has copied another man's life almost perfectly. But not quite. He's left small stitches loose, and now I'm afraid we'll have to tug at them until the whole thing unravels." Cray looked at her. "Are you saying he's an impostor?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "No, I'm saying he's something far more dangerous, a man who believes he deserves another's life, and he's nearly convinced everyone, including himself." And with that, she turned back toward the village, already thinking of the next stitch to pull. Inspector Cray agreed to reopen interviews the following morning, though reluctantly. Miss Marple's observations had unsettled him. He didn't like being shown what he should have noticed himself. But pride had little place in real police work, and the facts, as they stood, refused to settle. So he arranged to speak with the key. Witnesses again, this time in the sitting room of the vicarage, with Miss Marple seated quietly by the window, knitting in hand and ears open. Eleanor Dorsey was the first. Her face was pale but set, and her voice soft but rehearsed. She spoke of her husband's return with an odd mix of awe and numbness. "When I saw him," she said, "I felt like I'd dreamed him back into being. Everything was the same. The way he stood, the smell of his coat, even the crease on his left cheek when he frowned. I never doubted it. I couldn't afford to." Inspector Cray leaned forward. "And since his return, has anything felt off to you? Anything at all?" Eleanor's pause was brief, but Miss Marple caught the flicker in her fingers, the momentary tightening around the teacup. "He's quieter, more thoughtful. But who wouldn't be after what he went through?" Cray nodded. "And the night Mavis Gilbert died? He was in bed. With me, as I said." Miss Marple glanced up then. "Forgive me, Mrs. Dorsey, but did you hear him come to bed? Or did you simply wake and find him there?" Eleanor hesitated longer this time. "I woke to find him there." Cray scribbled something, then dismissed her politely. She left without another word, but her shoes clicked sharply on the floorboards, too quickly, as if she were retreating from something rather than leaving it behind. Next came Mrs. Fetcher from the general store. She seemed overly cheerful, smiling too often and glancing at Cray as if expecting approval. "Oh yes, I remember that man at the inn, Lawrence Hill," he said. "Friendly, but too curious. Asked about the Dorseys, the vicarage, even my cousin's farm near the cliffs. I thought maybe he was writing a book." Miss Marple looked up again. "Did he say where he was from?" "Oh, somewhere north. Lancashire, maybe." Didn't sound like he'd lived there long, though, not with the way he said scones, posh-like. And he left before Henry returned? Yes, maybe a week or so before. Strange timing now that I think of it. She left still smiling, but Miss Marple saw her stop outside the window, look back at the vicarage, and only then walk away. More slowly than before, as if waiting to see who came next. That was young Charlie Griggs, the gardener's boy. He fidgeted in his seat, avoiding Miss Marple's eyes, and looking anywhere but at the inspector. "I saw Mr. Dorsey in the garden the morning Mavis died," he mumbled. "Early, before anyone else was awake. He was digging by the hedge near that gnome thing." Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch. "Did he see you?" Cray asked. "No, sir. I was cutting across to the back lane. Didn't want to be late again." "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Charlie looked down. "Because later that day he saw me by the tool shed and asked if I'd been there in the morning. I said no, but he looked at me too long, like he knew. I was lying and, I don't know, it just didn't feel safe." Miss Marple spoke gently. "You're very brave to say it now, and you're quite right. Sometimes danger wears the face we least expect." Charlie left with a small nod, and then came Reverend Mortimer. The vicar's expression was troubled. "I fear I must confess something, Inspector. A week before Mr. Dorsey's return, I received an anonymous note, typed unsigned. It said simply, 'The dead do not return. Beware the mask.' I dismissed it as a prank, but now I wish I hadn't." "Do you still have it?" Cray asked sharply. Mortimer nodded and handed it over. The paper was yellowing slightly at the edges, folded once, the type neat but uneven, as though from an old machine. Cray frowned. "Why didn't you mention this sooner?" I thought it nonsense. But now, Miss Marple reached over. "May I?" She held the paper to the light. The texture was old, yes, but the crease sharp, recently folded. And faintly in the top corner, the indentation of something else. A partial name, perhaps. Geo, just barely visible. Cray turned to her. "You think this connects to George Latham?" "I think someone forgot how pressure from an old typewriter leaves traces on the sheet beneath." Only one interview remained. The Dorseys' next-door neighbour, Mrs. Agnes Farley. Elderly, opinionated and slightly deaf, she arrived flustered and brimming with complaint. "It's the noise, Inspector. Since he came back, there's always a banging at night. I never heard such things when poor Henry was gone." Miss Marple blinked. "Banging?" "Yes, from the shed or the attic. It's not rats. I know rats. And lights, sometimes, at hours no decent person keeps. I told Eleanor, but she just smiled and said I was imagining things. Me. I've lived next to that house 20 years. Cray asked about the night Mavis was killed. Mrs. Farley raised a high brow. Well, I heard nothing then. But 2 days later I saw Mr. Dorsey carrying something wrapped in oilcloth into the back hedge. A long shape. I thought it odd. "Odd enough to mention now," Cray muttered. "Well, yes, I didn't want to meddle." Miss Marple smiled softly. "Sometimes meddling is simply noticing the things others choose not to see." As the vicarage emptied, the room felt heavier. Cray rubbed his forehead. "We've got 4 people saying 4 different things. A husband returned from the dead. A maid murdered. A boy with fear in his voice. An anonymous warning. And none of it fits." Miss Marple's needles clicked once, then stopped. "It does fit, Inspector, but not as you expect. We've listened to their words. Now we must listen to their silences, the things they didn't say. Eleanor didn't ask where her husband had been. The shopkeeper smiled too much. The boy saw more than he admitted, and the vicar forgot to mention a threat until now. Somewhere in all of that is the truth, but it's wrapped in kindness, fear, and loyalty, and I think it's about to fray. She folded her knitting and stood, her expression unreadable. Someone has built a very fragile web here. One tug more, and it shall unravel itself. Inspector Cray stood by the fireplace in the vicarage, arms crossed, the anonymous note still clutched in his hand. The testimonies sat in his notebook, like jagged pieces from different puzzles, each nearly fitting but refusing to settle into one complete picture. Beside him, Miss Marple remained seated with her knitting folded in her lap, not watching him, but rather the fire's reflection, in the glass of the nearby cabinet, as though waiting for it to reveal something. "We have too many reasons and not enough answers," Cray muttered. Miss Marple looked up. "Or precisely enough reasons, just layered beneath each other. When truth hides, it often wears several hats at once." Cray turned. "So where do we begin?" Miss Marple unfolded her hands slowly. "With the motive no one admits aloud. Let us say this man is not Henry Dorsey, though he wears his face well. If so, he must have desired something Henry left behind. Property, reputation, safety. But none of those explain Mavis Gilbert." Cray flipped through his notebook. The girl didn't have enemies. She had a good record, steady work, and no family. Miss Marple added softly, "Which makes her both vulnerable and easy to silence." He stared at her. "She found something," Miss Marple continued, "something that made her realize Henry wasn't who he claimed to be. She may have hesitated, unsure what to do. Perhaps she tried to confront Eleanor or warned her. Either way, she became a threat. And threats, to men like this one, are dealt with quickly." Cray exhaled. "But what did he want? The house? It's not valuable. Eleanor's not rich. There's no will that we know of worth forging." "Then perhaps it's not about acquiring something," Miss Marple said, rising. "Perhaps it's about disappearing." Over the next day, Cray began pulling at the tangled skein of identities and relationships with newfound purpose. First, he requested background checks. There had been no medical record, military paper, or police report filed under Henry Dorsey's name in the 3 years of his absence. Not in Devon, not in Cornwall, not in the north. But a request flagged something peculiar. A missing persons file from Lancashire closed 2 months earlier, describing a man named Michael Reeves, who closely matched Henry's description. Reeves had worked briefly in construction, disappeared, after being named in a pending fraud case. His wife had reported him missing after he left home claiming he'd go clean, then vanished. Cray brought this to Miss Marple late in the evening. She read the report, lips pursed. "It makes sense," she said. "Reeves needed a new identity. Henry's disappearance left a tidy gap. No body recovered, no witness. A clever man could step into that shadow, especially if he found something personal, an old letter perhaps, or a family photograph. Then he just needed time. And someone, like George Latham, someone he met and studied before assuming the role." Cray nodded. "And Latham?" "Likely the first trial run," Miss Marple said. "A man who already resembled Henry in some features. Perhaps Reeves tested the waters by claiming Latham's name at the inn. But too many people would know Latham had died, so he shifted again. this time for good. So what connects Reeves to Eleanor? Miss Marple tilted her head. Not love, I think, nor blackmail. I believe Eleanor knew he wasn't her husband. At first, she may have convinced herself it was grief or hope or delusion. But somewhere along the way, she chose silence, perhaps out of fear, perhaps because she saw in him a way to rewrite her life. That afternoon, Cray called Eleanor back to the vicarage. She wore grey again, but her hair was styled, her movements more controlled. When pressed about Reeves, she didn't blink. Knew, she said calmly. Not at first. But after the first week, it became clear. The way he buttoned his shirts, wrong hand. His laugh was higher. He mispronounced Aunt Sylvia's name. He even stood differently in the hall mirror. Cray stared at her. And you said nothing. I said everything by saying nothing. She met his gaze. I buried Henry, truly. I mourned him, lived 3 years in that echo. When this man came to the door, I knew he wasn't my husband. But I let him in because, for once, someone needed me. He was on the run. I could see that in his eyes. And Mavis? She found a letter in Henry's old coat, one Reeves had overlooked. It mentioned a family holiday in Dorset, a place Reeves hadn't mentioned once. She asked me about it. I told her to forget it. She said she was going to speak with the vicar. That night, she died. Eleanor's voice didn't waver, but something in her eyes dulled as she spoke. Cray asked, "Did Reeves kill her?" "Yes." "You're sure?" "I'm sure." He came to bed late, mud on his sleeves. He thought I was asleep. Miss Marple, who had been silent until now, finally asked, "Why didn't you leave him then?" "Because he needed me. And that terrified me more than anything. Because no one's ever needed me that way, not even Henry." The room remained silent for a long moment. Then Eleanor stood. "He didn't want me. He wanted my silence. And he bought it with loneliness." After she left, Cray turned to Miss Marple. "So what now? We arrest him?" "In time," she said. "But one question remains unanswered. If Reeves was running, why here? Why now? Why not simply vanish?" And as she spoke, Cray's assistant burst through the door, holding a telegram. "It's from Lancashire. A new detail just surfaced." Cray read it aloud. Reeves withdrew funds from a joint account the day before arriving in Kingsbridge Hollow. Thousands. Then closed it. He was being watched. Surveillance ended abruptly. When he vanished, Miss Marple took a breath. Then he didn't come here to disappear. He came here because someone was chasing him. And whoever it is, they might already be close. The fire crackled behind them. Shadows moved in the corners. The maze of motives had a new wall now, not just fear and deception, but escape. And somewhere inside that tangle, Miss Marple knew, another lie waited to be unearthed. Rain came down, in steady ribbons the next morning, soaking the hedgerows and painting the lanes in grey. The village of Kingsbridge Hollow looked quieter than usual, as though the mist itself were holding its breath. At the station in nearby Market Broad, Inspector Cray received word that a man had been arrested in Liverpool under the name Michael Reeves. A witness claimed he had seen Reeves boarding a coach 2 days earlier, and the man was found with forged documents, large sums of cash, and a revolver hidden in his suitcase. It all fit too neatly. Cray read the report once, then again, each line falling into place with almost mechanical precision. He could feel the weight of the case lifting, at least on paper. By noon, the village was buzzing. The story had spread with unnatural speed, and by the time Cray returned to Kingsbridge Hollow, people were speaking in relieved tones. They said the man pretending to be Henry Darcy was caught, justice was at hand, and perhaps the village could rest again. At Primrose Cottage, Eleanor remained indoors, not responding to questions, her curtains drawn tight. But Miss Marple wasn't celebrating. She sat in the tea-room across from Reverend Mortimer, her teacup untouched, eyes on the rain-slicked window. "It's too soon," she said quietly. "Too neat. It's a performance, not a conclusion." The Reverend hesitated. "But surely if they've caught Reeves—" "Have they?" she asked. "Or have they caught someone who looks like Reeves? And even if it is him, there's one thing that troubles me greatly. Why leave when he'd spent so long settling in here? Why abandon Eleanor? Why leave a body buried under a garden gnome? And most importantly, why take nothing with him?" Mortimer furrowed his brow. "You think the man arrested isn't the one who posed as Henry?" "I think it's possible," she said. "Or that we're being made to believe the story is finished before it truly is. A very dangerous trick, that. It lulls people into quiet just when they should be watching most closely." Later that afternoon, Cray held a press statement in the village hall. He spoke with deliberate calm, announcing the identification and arrest of Michael Reeves, citing corroborating evidence and physical similarities. A press photographer even came from Exeter, snapping pictures of the inspector beneath the hanging lamps as villagers whispered and nodded approval. And yet, in the corner of the hall, Miss Marple sat alone, eyes fixed on the tiled floor, seeing something no one else was looking for. That evening, she returned to Primrose Cottage. Eleanor answered the door, her eyes hollow, her movements slower than before. The house was cold. Miss Marple asked to sit, and Eleanor nodded silently. "They say it's over," Eleanor whispered, after a long pause. "And do you believe them?" Miss Marple asked. "I don't know what I believe anymore. The man who lived here, he had Henry's voice, Henry's smile, but none of his memories. I told myself that grief can make liars of us all. But even lies become familiar if you keep them long enough." Miss Marple reached into her handbag and unfolded the telegram from Liverpool. "I read this carefully. The man they've arrested had the cash Reeves withdrew, yes, and documents with his name. But what it doesn't mention is more telling. There's no mention of a scar on his left wrist, something you said Henry had. No mention of the mole behind his ear." Eleanor swallowed hard. "They want to close this case. They want it done because it's uncomfortable. But justice, my dear, is rarely comfortable. It's often inconvenient, sometimes deeply so." The next morning, Miss Marple returned to the shed one last time. Rain had softened the ground again. With a borrowed spade, she dug carefully beside the hedge, not where the gnome had stood, but slightly off-centre, where the soil had never properly resettled. 6 inches down, she found a small wooden box, sealed with wax. Inside was a pocket watch, a wedding ring, and a yellowing photograph. On the back of the photo was written in faded ink, "To my Eleanor forever." HD, she brought the box to Cray, without a word. When he opened it, something in his face shifted. "This was real," she said. "This man, whoever he was, killed Henry. He didn't just impersonate him. He buried him twice, first in the sea, then in the soil." Cray looked up. "But if that's so, and Reeves is already in custody, Then someone helped him, Miss Marple said quietly. Or someone else has stepped into his place. Cray rubbed a hand over his mouth. A partner, perhaps. Or a rival. Or someone with more to lose than Reeves ever had. The timing of the arrest, the lack of proper identification. It's not resolution, Inspector. It's a curtain drop before the final act. That night, Kingsbridge Hollow fell into a false calm. People spoke of closure, not knowing the most dangerous men are often those who pretend to be gone. In a small room at the edge of the village, someone lit a cigarette, hands steady, eyes watching the path that led to Primrose Cottage. The shadow returned, not cast by sun, but by intent, and this time it was waiting for darkness to move again. Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting once more. The rain had stopped. The silence was not peace. It was simply a pause between the next knock on the door. The following morning, Miss Marple sat with a cup of lukewarm tea at the Rosewood Inn, her notebook open before her. The box she'd uncovered, Henry Dorsey's watch, ring and photograph, sat under lock and key in Inspector Cray's office now, but its presence lingered like a quiet echo. It had not just proven that Reeves or someone had taken over Henry's life. It had reopened something older, deeper. The photo had been dated, not recently, 15 years ago. A faint inscription on the back, Torquay, 1936. And that, Miss Marple knew, was a year that had once whispered through another name. George Latham. She returned to the village hall to search parish records, officially looking for burial dates, unofficially hunting memory. In a battered leather volume beneath a stack of old receipts and council minutes, she found it. A photo from the Torquay Chamber Choir, 1936. Eleanor, Henry, George Latham, and a fourth man. His name was written in faded ink beneath the photo, M. Reeves. She stared at it for a long moment. So Reeves wasn't a stranger to Henry. They had known each other, perhaps even closely. That meant the identity theft had not been random. It had been selected, personal. She returned to the vicarage, where Reverend Mortimer was writing out sermon notes. He looked up as she entered. "I was just about to send for you," he said. "Something's come up." He handed her a crumpled envelope. This came through the side door, no postmark, slipped under the mat. Inside was a single photograph, grainy, black and white. Henry Dorsey, sitting on a bench outside the village school, speaking with a man in a tweed coat. The second man's back was to the camera, but Miss Marple recognized the silhouette. George Latham. On the reverse, they all lied. That afternoon, she and Cray stood side by side in the records room of the regional police office, pulling boxes from the archives. One held an old case file, dusty, corners curling, but still legible. In 1937, a fire had broken out in a Torquay guest house. 2 men were listed as injured, George Latham and Michael Reeves. The fire was ruled accidental. But the cause? Faulty wiring, so said the report. Yet on the margin of one witness statement, someone had written a line and circled it. They argued about money before it happened. Cray read it aloud. "You think this was where it began?" Miss Marple nodded. A betrayal buried beneath ashes. Latham, Reeves and Dorsey must have been involved in something more than singing choirs. Money was missing. Latham disappeared from the records shortly. After that, Dorsey moved to Kingsbridge Hollow and married Eleanor. Reeves vanished entirely. Cray frowned. And now he returns, or someone does, and starts clearing the board. She tapped the photograph from the choir again. They all knew something. George Latham died, supposedly, in a boating accident with Henry. Except now, we suspect Henry was killed. So who was the other body? Cray blinked. You think Reeves killed both of them? No, she said slowly. I think Reeves may have been one of the victims, the real Reeves, the man we think is Reeves, maybe someone else altogether. A pause settled between them. Then Cray muttered, "Dear God." Miss Marple stood and collected her coat. This isn't about fraud or hiding. It's about vengeance. Someone has waited years to play a part, and they've worn more than one name to do it. They returned to Primrose Cottage just before dusk. Eleanor opened the door slowly, her face ashen. "He's gone," she whispered. "Left without a word. Last night, after the news came in." Miss Marple entered and walked directly to the drawing room. Something felt off. The fire had gone cold, but a faint smell lingered in the air. Charred. Paper. She opened the grate and found the remains of letters. Ashes. Fragments. A burned edge of a boarding pass. Something that might have said Reeves or Latham, too far gone to tell. Miss Marple turned. "Did he take anything?" Eleanor hesitated. "A bag. One of Henry's old ones. And he said something. Before he left." "What?" "That he never wanted to be Henry. He only wanted the world to forget who he really was." Later that night, Miss Marple returned to the photograph again. She looked not at the faces, but at the background, a corner of a street sign just visible. She took it to Cray. Together they matched it to a street in Brixham. A small antiques shop still stood there. It had belonged once to a man named Francis Elwell, arrested in 1935 for fencing stolen goods. He had been connected, according to footnotes, to a minor fraud ring involving forged paintings. 3 names appeared in the report's side annotations: Latham, Reeves, and M. Holloway. Cray. "Read it aloud." "Holloway." Miss Marple smiled grimly. "I believe our man never was Reeves. He's Holloway, a 4th friend, a quiet one, a forger likely. He escaped prison while his accomplices burned or disappeared. He's been living under borrowed names ever since, so he's not Henry, not Reeves, not Latham. He's the shadow," she said. "The one who was always in the background. And now he's finished burying his past, one man at a time." Cray whispered, "And now he's gone." Miss Marple shook her head. "Not yet. He hasn't visited the last name on his list." Cray asked, "Whose?" She met his gaze evenly. "Eleanor Dorsey." Rain returned, but softer now, a drizzle that whispered across the cobbles. Somewhere a man who had erased others was preparing to vanish again. But Miss Marple knew. Shadows might flee, but the past never truly forgets, and neither did she. The morning fog settled low over Kingsbridge Hollow, clinging to the fields and rooftops like a secret refusing to lift. Miss Marple walked the village green slowly, her expression as composed as ever, but her thoughts wound tightly through the knots left behind by the man with too many names. She had known from the moment he claimed to be Henry that something about him resisted alignment with the past. But now, after days of unraveling lies and layered motives, the truth was nearly in reach, and to grasp it, She needed something not in records or testimony, but in the subtle fault line between what a person says and how they choose to say it. Inspector Cray arrived at Rosewood Inn mid-morning, his coat damp, his manner agitated. He had received word from Liverpool. The man arrested as Reeves had been released. Wrong identity. No scar on the wrist. No matching dental records. No sign he had ever been in Kingsbridge Hollow. Cray swore softly under his breath, then glanced at Miss Marple, who did not look surprised. "I thought so," she said, stirring her tea. "The real Holloway, or whatever name he goes by now, is still here, or near. He wouldn't run until—" He was finished. Cray leaned against the table. "You said Eleanor might be next. Why not take her with him? Why leave at all?" Miss Marple looked up. "Because he never loved her. She was a witness, a pawn, a piece he needed to keep the illusion steady. But now that the illusion is crumbling, she has become a liability." Cray nodded. "We've circulated descriptions. No trace." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Then we must make him come to us. But not as Henry, not as Reeves. We must tempt him to reveal the one thing he can't fake. The person he truly is, underneath all the names." She sent a message to Eleanor that afternoon, requesting a visit at Primrose Cottage. Eleanor, though still drawn and pale, agreed. Miss Marple arrived carrying a covered tray, which she placed on the table in the drawing room. "I thought we'd have a proper afternoon tea," she said, smiling. "It used to be Henry's favourite, didn't it?" Eleanor gave a weak nod. "He liked the clotted cream." Miss Marple set out the cups, the scones, the preserves, and then, almost casually, she brought out an old, cracked teacup from her bag. "Do you recognize this?" Eleanor blinked. "Yes, that's Henry's. He broke it just after we moved in. Said it was his grandmother's." "I found it in the attic," Miss Marple lied smoothly. "I thought it might mean something to him if he came back." Eleanor looked down. Her fingers trembled slightly. "I've invited someone for tea," Miss Marple said gently. "I hope you don't mind. A friend of Henry's, from the choir days." Eleanor's gaze sharpened. "You did?" Miss Marple nodded and poured the tea. Half an hour later, there was a knock on the door. Miss Marple opened it to reveal a man with a weathered face and a quiet smile. He wore a grey coat and carried a walking stick. His name, he said, was Philip March, a retired choir master from Torquay. "Philip," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "You remember Henry Dorsey?" The man smiled faintly. "Of course, and George Latham, and Reeves." Miss Marple gestured him in. "Do come sit. We were just speaking of old times." Eleanor stiffened as the man entered, but her eyes didn't meet his. The stranger spoke with the warmth of someone who belonged. He recalled the guest-house fire of '37. He remembered Henry's laugh, and as he spoke, Eleanor's hands curled tighter around her teacup. Then Miss Marple asked, "And do you remember Michael Holloway?" Philip March paused. Eleanor looked up sharply. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "Because I've found references to a fourth man, one who knew the rest, but stayed hidden after the fire, one who disappeared, then resurfaced when no one was watching." Cray raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple stood still for a moment, the storm outside growing heavier. The answer was staring her in the face, but it took a moment for the pieces to align. "The person who stole the photo isn't trying to cover their own tracks. They're trying to stop us from looking any further. It's a warning." A warning? Cray asked, incredulous. Yes, she said, her voice steady. The photo wasn't just evidence. It was the key to the last part of the story. Whoever took it doesn't want us digging into what comes next. Cray leaned against the desk, the weight of the situation settling in. So, who would do something like this? Miss Marple's gaze flickered toward the open file cabinet. The question isn't who, it's why. By the time Miss Marple returned to Primrose Cottage, the quiet had thickened. The house felt almost too still. Eleanor was seated by the fire, her posture tense, her eyes distant. She looked up as Miss Marple entered but didn't speak immediately. "I heard," Eleanor said finally, her voice thin. "I know they've taken it, haven't they?" "The photograph?" Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. How could she have known? "Eleanor, how did you—" Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. "He was here." "Who?" "The man who came back. He came to me last night. He said I should make sure you weren't looking in places you shouldn't." Eleanor's eyes locked onto Miss Marple's. "He knew I knew. And now they've taken it." A chill swept through the room. Miss Marple's mind clicked into overdrive. She had seen the way Eleanor had reacted to the strange guest, Philip March. But this was something different. The realization hit her like a wave. "Do you mean the man who was arrested?" Miss Marple asked. Eleanor shook her head. "No, it wasn't him. It was the other one. The one who claimed to be Henry, when I didn't know any better." It all clicked into place. The missing photograph, the stolen evidence, the secrecy. This wasn't just about covering the tracks of a past forgery ring. This was about erasing the past altogether, about ensuring that a final truth could never reach the surface. "You knew him better than you let on," Miss Marple said softly. Eleanor's eyes were distant now, almost hollow. "I loved him once. I thought I did. But I should have known. All those years, and he was never the man I thought he was. When he came back, I wanted to believe. I wanted to believe he was my Henry again. But in the end, it wasn't him." Miss Marple stepped closer. "You didn't know?" "No. Not until recently. When things started feeling wrong, when he became more and more distant, when he started talking about a new life. But by then I was already too afraid. Too afraid to say anything." And then Miss Marple understood. It wasn't just the stolen photograph or the missing records that were part of the plan. It was the manipulation, the way the real Henry's name had been buried under years of lies. The Yoi person who had truly returned wasn't just Michael Holloway or the fraud they had uncovered. He was a man who had spent years erasing not just the past, but the people in it who could expose him. Cray had been right about one thing: someone was working against them. But it wasn't just about keeping the secrets of a past life intact. It was about ensuring that the truth stayed buried forever. And as Miss Marple stood there, watching Eleanor's fragile resolve crumble, she knew that the game was far from over. Someone was still out there, moving in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The tension in the air was palpable. Miss Marple sat by the fire at Rosewood Inn, a cup of untouched tea in front of her, her mind racing through the clues that had unfolded so far. The stolen photograph, the cryptic warnings, and now Eleanor's unsettling admission. Everything pointed to a man who was as elusive as he was dangerous. She knew he had never left. He had been watching from the shadows, just as he always had. But Then an unexpected knock at the door shattered the quiet. Miss Marple rose and opened it slowly, half expecting someone from the village with news, but instead a figure she barely recognized stood in the doorway, Reverend Mortimer. His face, pale and eyes wide with distress. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight, "it's happened. Another body has been found." Her stomach tightened. "Another?" "Yes. Just hours ago near the cliffs." He swallowed hard, his hands shaking slightly. "It's Philip March, the man you spoke with yesterday. He's been murdered." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. "Murdered?" "Yes. The same way as Mavis Gilbert. No struggle, no signs of a fight, just dead." The Reverend shook his head. "He was found by the Coast Guard just below the cliff path. The most alarming part is the body was positioned in a way that suggests he was made to look like an accident. But Miss Marple, I think someone's trying to tell us something." The news hit Miss Marple like a weight, but she didn't falter. She had known, deep down, that this was coming. The pattern was becoming all too familiar. The past couldn't be buried, not while someone still held the threads of it, pulling them tighter. She quickly gathered her things, and with Reverend Mortimer in tow, made her way toward the cliffs. The wind was biting, the rain a distant memory, but the weight of the moment pressed down on her as they arrived at the scene. The body was sprawled at the base of a jagged rock, an eerie stillness surrounding it. There were no signs of a struggle, as the Reverend had said, just the lifeless body of Philip March, his once warm face now twisted in an expression that spoke of shock more than pain. But what struck Miss Marple most was the positioning. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. The body had been laid out, its arms tucked by the sides, and the face angled upward, as though he had been placed carefully. A single white rose lay across his chest, an odd and almost poetic detail in such a grim setting. This was no accident, Miss Marple murmured to herself. Someone wanted him to be found like this, but why? She knelt beside the body, carefully avoiding disturbing anything. Her eyes scanned the scene. The same eerie calm pervaded the area as when Mavis Gilbert's body had been found. No signs of panic, no chaos. Just a deliberate arrangement meant to send a message. Reverend Mortimer watched her intently, his face etched with confusion. "Do you think this is connected to the earlier murders? To the man who claimed to be Henry Dorsey?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly. "This is still part of the same game, but now the stakes have been raised, and whoever is playing it is more desperate than before." "Desperate?" The Reverend raised an eyebrow. Miss Marple stood, looking down at the body one last time. "Yes, Reverend. This isn't just about hiding secrets anymore. This is about silencing anyone who could reveal the truth." Cray arrived soon after, his face tight with the strain of the investigation. He immediately took charge, ordering the body to be removed and the area secured. As the officers worked, Cray approached Miss Marple, his frustration evident. "It doesn't make sense," he muttered. March was just a witness, a minor player, at best. Why kill him? Why make it look like an accident? If he was involved in any way, he wouldn't have been left so exposed. Miss Marple's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. March had been a link to the past, a connection to Henry, George Latham, and the tangled web of lies that had been spun around them. But there was more to it. The murder wasn't just about silencing him, It was about ensuring that the last piece of the puzzle stayed hidden. "Someone doesn't want us asking the right questions," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "And they're willing to kill to keep us from finding the answers." Cray looked at her, his expression softening. "But what now? How do we stop them?" Miss Marple's gaze hardened, her resolve sharpening like a blade. "We stop asking the wrong questions. We stop trying to piece the past together with what's left behind. The real clue isn't in the old files or the photographs, it's in the present. Whoever is doing this is still in the village, watching, waiting for the next move." Just as Cray was about to respond, a sharp voice interrupted them. "It's him. I know it's him." Eleanor Dorsey stood nearby, her face pale but her eyes fierce. She had overheard the conversation and had approached them without warning. Miss Marple turned to her, surprised by the sudden appearance. "Eleanor?" she asked gently. "What do you mean?" Eleanor took a step closer, her gaze fixed on the body of Philip March. "I don't know who he was, really. Not the man who came back. But I know that whoever did this is still here. They're still watching me. They're still—" Her voice broke, and Miss Marple stepped forward, placing a hand on her arm. "Eleanor, you're not alone in this. But I need you to tell me what you know. Who are you afraid of?" Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper. "It's Michael Holloway. It has to be him. He's been playing us all, and now he's gone too far." Cray stiffened at the mention of the name, but Miss Marple kept her focus on Eleanor. "You know him?" Eleanor nodded, her eyes clouded with fear. "He was never Henry. He was never any of them. He was always Michael Holloway, and he'll keep killing until he's got what he wants." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Miss Marple looked at Cray, her voice low but firm. "It's not over, and we're running out of time." As the last remnants of the fog began to lift from the village, Miss Marple knew the truth was almost within reach. But so, too, was the danger. Michael Holloway was still out there, and now he had made it personal. The days following Philip March's murder were heavy with the kind of tension that never seemed to fully break. The village was no longer simply a quiet place for gossip and whispers. It was now a battleground of suspicions, where no one could move without wondering whether they were being watched. Miss Marple had seen the toll it took on people, that constant strain of uncertainty. But amid the chaos, she began to see a pattern, one that had always been in plain sight, but had slipped past unnoticed. The clue had been there in the smallest of moments, hiding in the edges of the case. A comment here, a glance there, an offhand remark that at the time had seemed trivial. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. She sat at the Rosewood Inn late one evening, her mind turning over the details like a puzzle, piecing together the fragments that had once seemed disconnected. It was Eleanor's comment that had first triggered the thought, how she had said, almost casually, that Holloway wasn't interested in her, that he never had been. It was true, Miss Marple knew, that someone who had spent years constructing such elaborate deceptions wouldn't care much for genuine love or affection. But Eleanor had said something else that had slipped past at the time. "He only wanted to see if I would believe in him again." The realization hit Miss Marple like a slow-moving wave. Holloway hadn't just been hiding behind the faces of Henry Dorsey, Michael Reeves, and others. He had been manipulating the very people who had once known him, using them to test his own ability to escape the past, to disappear, and remake himself. But that wasn't the most startling part. The real revelation came when she thought back to the funeral, to the weeks before his return. The way Eleanor had acted, her hesitations, the questions that had lingered in her eyes when the body of her husband had been lowered into the ground. The grief had felt too genuine, too heavy. But in that grief had also been a sense of relief, a sense that she was finally free from the past. Miss Marple stood up abruptly, her mind firing with the connections she had made. It had been there all along, the missing piece, the key that could unlock the rest of the puzzle. The whole thing was about control, about power. Holloway hadn't just been using his old acquaintances to cover up his past. He had been testing his ability to control them, to make them complicit in his deception. Cray had been right to say they were running out of time. But Miss Marple now understood something deeper. Holloway's true aim was never just to escape. It had been to control the story, to shape the narrative to his liking, using the people who cared about him to ensure no one would ever uncover the truth. That's why he had killed Philip March. March had been the only one who could have given them the final piece of the puzzle. March had known too much about the past, and when that became clear, Holloway had silenced him. With the pieces falling into place, Miss Marple wasted no time. She called for Cray to meet her at Primrose Cottage, where they could finally put the last part of the plan into motion. She knew they weren't just dealing with a murderer anymore. They were dealing with a man who was playing a far more dangerous game. And the only way to beat him was to outmaneuver him on his own turf. Cray arrived soon after, his face drawn and tired from the constant pressure of the investigation. "What have you figured out?" he asked as he stepped into the room. Miss Marple paused, her fingers lightly touching the edge of the photograph she had retrieved from the file. "We've been looking in the wrong places," she said quietly. The motive was never about money or revenge, or even about hiding his past. It was about power, about controlling the narrative. Cray frowned. "Power? Yes," she said, her eyes alight with understanding. Holloway didn't want just to live freely. He wanted to be the one to decide who remembered him and how. He didn't want his past to be uncovered, because then his control would slip away. The photo, the forged identities, it wasn't just a cover-up, it was a test, and each of the people he deceived was part of that test. She looked at Cray, a flash of something fierce in her gaze. He didn't care about the money. He didn't care about the estate or the house. He cared about being able to walk through life with no one ever questioning who he was, who he'd been. He wanted to be forgotten and remade, and he wanted the power to decide who could remember him and how. Cray stood silently, absorbing her words. The weight of the realization hit him as well. So, he killed Philip because Philip was a witness to his past. He was the one who knew too much. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "But it's not just about Philip. It's about Eleanor. It's about her remembering the truth and knowing that her husband had never been the man he claimed to be. And when she began to suspect the truth, when she started to pull at the threads of his carefully constructed life, he had to stop her too." Cray's face hardened. "So what now? How do we stop him?" Miss Marple paused, considering. "We confront him with the one thing he can't control, the truth. He's been manipulating everyone, including himself, into believing he can rewrite the past, but he can't rewrite the truth, and the truth is what he fears most." The plan came together quickly after that. Miss Marple knew the next move had to come from them, not from the police or from the village. They needed to draw Holloway out, to make him react in a way that would expose his true intentions. And to do that, they needed one final piece: confrontation. That night, as the clock struck midnight, Miss Marple and Cray waited in the darkened hall of Primrose Cottage, watching the shadows outside. They had sent Eleanor away, making sure she was safe from whatever might come. It was then that the figure emerged from the darkness. Michael Holloway, his face shadowed, his movements controlled. "I've been waiting for you, Miss Marple," said softly, her voice cutting through the quiet. Holloway froze, his gaze snapping to her. For a moment there was silence, the kind that presses down on everything, making the air thick with expectation. He finally spoke, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You think you can stop me? You think you can unearth the past and expose me, Miss—" Marple met his gaze, her resolve unwavering. "No, I think the truth will stop you." In that moment, Holloway knew. He had been caught in the one thing he couldn't escape, the pattern that had been in plain sight all along. And no matter how hard he tried to control the narrative, the story had always been bigger than he was. Holloway's face was a mask of controlled anger, his eyes darkened with a mixture of recognition and defiance. He had been caught, but he wasn't ready to surrender just yet. The stillness between him and Miss Marple was thick, the tension almost suffocating. Cray, standing a few feet away, could feel it too, but his expression remained grimly focused, not letting the intimidation in Holloway's posture shake him. "You think you understand?" Holloway's voice cut through the silence, his words clipped and edged with a harshness that made the air feel colder. "You think you've got it all figured out?" Miss Marple's eyes, sharp and unyielding, stayed fixed on him. "I know you, Michael Holloway. Or should I say, I know you as every man but yourself. You've been running your whole life, haven't you? Hiding behind false names, false faces, a new identity every time you couldn't escape the last one." For the briefest moment, Holloway's composure slipped. He exhaled sharply, his hands curling into fists at his sides, a silent admission that Miss Marple had hit closer to the truth than he had wanted her to. "And what of it?" he sneered. "Isn't that what everyone does? Running, pretending to be someone else until they can't, until the lies catch up. I'm no different than anyone else." Miss Marple stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "No, you're different. You're not running from your past. You're running from the person you are." His eyes flashed with something dangerous. "You think I'm some kind of monster? That I've been hiding because I'm ashamed?" "No," Miss Marple said gently, her voice steady but carrying a weight of truth. "Not ashamed, but terrified. Terrified that if you stop running, you'll finally have to face the thing you've been trying to escape, yourself." Holloway's eyes hardened. "You're wrong." Miss Marple didn't flinch. "Am I?" She leaned in slightly, her tone softening just enough to make her next words sting. "What did you want, Michael? What did you truly want from all of this? Power? Revenge? A chance to take everything from those who wronged you?" He scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous. It wasn't about them. Not really. And it wasn't about any of that either." "Then what was it about?" Miss Marple asked. "What was so important that you were willing to kill for it?" There was a long pause, a moment of raw vulnerability that flickered in Holloway's eyes before the mask slipped back into place. His voice, when he spoke, was quieter, almost brittle. "I just wanted to be free." Cray looked between them, his brow furrowing. Free? From what? Holloway laughed, but there was no humor in it. From myself. From the person I was before. The man I was forced to become. The words hung in the air like an unspoken confession. A revelation that for all of his deception and manipulation, Holloway was not simply a cold-blooded criminal. He wasn't driven by money or revenge or any of the things people might have assumed. The truth was far more complex. His motives, twisted and frail as they were, came from something deeper, a psychological wound that had shaped his entire existence. Miss Marple looked at him closely, seeing past the defiance to something raw and hidden beneath. Your whole life, you've been trying to reinvent yourself, she said slowly, her voice filled with both understanding and pity. You couldn't bear who you were, could you? Not after everything that happened. The fire, the years of running, the loss. You didn't just want a new name, Michael. You wanted a new soul. He didn't answer at first. His breath came in shallow, uneven bursts, and for a fleeting moment, he seemed to shrink under the weight of the realization. Cray's eyes narrowed as he pieced together the confession. The fire in Torquay, he said quietly. It wasn't an accident, was it? You didn't just run from the past. You tried to destroy it. Holloway stiffened, but didn't deny it. That night, when the fire started, George Latham was already dead. He was never going to escape. Neither was I. But I did what I had to survive, to have a chance to be someone else. Miss Marple's face softened, though her gaze remained resolute. But you couldn't escape, could you? You were always going to be the person who killed George Latham, the person who destroyed a part of yourself. You've spent your life trying to outrun that, but the truth was always there, waiting for you to stop long enough to face it. Holloway's jaw tightened, but this time there was no anger in his expression, just something close to resignation. I thought if I could bury everything I could start over. But nothing ever changes. You can't outrun who you are, no matter how many names you wear. Miss Marple turned her gaze to Cray, who was silent but visibly processing the information. The murders, she said, the manipulation of Eleanor, the deaths, those were your way of erasing the parts of yourself you couldn't face. You killed Mavis Gilbert and Philip March because they were too close to discovering who you really were. But it wasn't just about silencing them. It was about keeping control over your past, keeping it buried. Cray nodded slowly. You didn't want anyone to uncover the truth because if they did, you would have to confront it yourself. Holloway's eyes narrowed, a slight tremor running through him. I didn't want anyone to know the truth because I knew. If they did, I'd be nothing. No more than a killer who couldn't keep his lies straight. Miss Marple watched him with quiet understanding. That's the trap, isn't it? You thought you could control the truth, rewrite it. But the more you tried to bury it, the more you became the very thing you feared. A long silence followed. Then Holloway spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. I never wanted this. Never wanted to be this. None of us do, Miss Marple replied softly. But the past always catches up, Michael. No one can outrun it forever. Holloway stood still for a long moment, staring at the ground. Then, without another word, he turned and walked to the door. The weight of his confession hung in the air like a fog, and Miss Marple, as always, remained silent, watching the man who had once tried to disappear, and who now had nowhere left to go. The truth was out, and with it, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The case was no longer about murder or deception. It was about the tragic toll of trying to escape one's own identity, and the lengths to which someone would go to destroy the self they couldn't bear to face. As the door closed behind Holloway, Cray looked at Miss Marple. "So it's over, then?" Miss Marple's expression remained unchanged, but her eyes held a quiet sorrow. "It's never truly over," she said softly. "The past always leaves a mark. And sometimes, even when we think we've buried it, it's still there, waiting to remind us of what we've done." And with that, the final chapter of their investigation closed, revealing not just a criminal, but a man broken by his own fear of who he had become. The tension in the air had been building for days, ever since Holloway's confession, a confession that had revealed the depth of his manipulation but not the full extent of his plans. Miss Marple knew better than anyone that the game wasn't over. Holloway had been in control of the narrative for far too long to simply admit defeat. He was too clever to let himself be caught so easily. Cray had been restless since the night of the confrontation, as if waiting for the inevitable second act to unfold. Every piece of the puzzle was now in place. Holloway's motive, his history, the manipulation of Eleanor, the murders, the stolen photograph, it all pointed to one undeniable truth. But Miss Marple had seen enough to know that this was the moment where everything could go horribly wrong. Holloway wouldn't simply surrender. He had to be outplayed. The trap was set, but the question remained. Would he walk right into it, or would he make one last desperate move? Miss Marple had carefully orchestrated her next steps. She had made sure that Eleanor was safely away from the cottage, under the care of a trusted friend, leaving the house empty. It was a place where Holloway would expect to find only the silence of his own deceit. But Miss Marple was there, waiting, and so was Cray. The clock ticked slowly, each second an echo of the inevitable showdown. Miss Marple sat in the dimly lit parlour, her hands folded, her mind sharp, her senses alert. Cray paced in the corner, his gaze flickering to the clock every few moments, impatience lining his jaw. He knew Holloway hadn't been caught yet, that there was still a chance he might slip away, but Miss Marple was confident. Holloway would come to her, drawn to the one thing he couldn't resist, his need to complete the story, to control the end. The door creaked open just as the final chime of the clock echoed through the room. Holloway stepped inside, his eyes scanning the shadows. He had been expecting this, Miss Marple knew. The silence, the absence of Eleanor, the calm before the storm. But Holloway was too calculating not to know that this wasn't the endgame. He wasn't done yet. "Miss Marple," Holloway said, his voice smooth and almost cordial, "I thought we'd gotten all this nonsense out of the way. You and I both know you won't stop. You'll keep looking, keep asking questions. But the truth has already been buried." Miss Marple didn't rise from her seat. She only met his gaze, steady and unwavering. "You were always good at creating a narrative, Michael. But even the best writers have to confront the plot they've built. You can't hide in the shadows forever." Holloway's lips twitched. "You think this is about shadows. You think this is about a story. It's not. It never was. It was always about surviving, about getting away from a life that didn't belong to me anymore." Miss Marple remained silent, watching him carefully. "But the thing about survival is that it's a lie. You built a life for yourself, a new identity. You buried your past, But you never truly left it behind. It followed you here, and in the end, it will always catch up. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, and Holloway stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. I made choices. I did what I had to do to escape a past that would have destroyed me. I tried to rebuild, to make something new. And now you think you can take that from me. You think you can tear apart everything I've worked for. Cray moved, his presence more visible now, his voice low but firm. You killed people to protect your secret, to protect your lies. Mavis Gilbert, Philip March, they knew too much. And now, you think you can just walk away without facing the consequences. Holloway's eyes flicked to Cray, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something, fear perhaps, or desperation. But it was quickly replaced by a cold mask. I did what I had to do, he said again, quieter now. No one was going to stand in my way, not again. Miss Marple rose from her seat slowly, her movements deliberate. She didn't approach him, but she didn't look away either. But you're wrong, Michael. You didn't just kill people. You didn't just erase your past. You erased everything that could have saved you. You thought you could control the story, but you never could. And now, here we are. Holloway stiffened. His jaw tightened. You don't know what it's like, being trapped in a life you didn't ask for. You don't understand what it's like, to wear someone else's name every day, and wonder if anyone will ever recognize you for who you truly are. No, Miss Marple said softly. Her eyes filled with quiet understanding. I don't. But I know what it's like to live with the consequences of what you've done, and that's what you can't run from anymore, Michael. The past is here, and it's not going anywhere. For a moment, there was silence. Holloway's breath was shallow, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. But there was none. He had run for years, hiding behind the faces of others. But the truth was waiting for him here, in this room, waiting to expose everything he had tried so desperately to bury. Why don't you just admit it? Miss Marple said, her voice calm but cutting through the tension. Admit that you never wanted freedom, Michael. You wanted power. You wanted to control everything, to make everyone believe in the man you wanted to be, not the one you truly were. You killed to keep that power, to make sure no one could see the truth. Holloway's face twisted for a moment, and for the first time, the mask cracked. The raw emotion beneath it, the fear, the desperation, all came rushing to the surface. I didn't kill them because I wanted to. I killed them because I had to. If I didn't, everything would fall apart, and I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't lose everything again. The confession was out. The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy with the admission that had been years in the making. Miss Marple didn't look away, didn't flinch. She had known this moment would come, the moment when the truth would finally crack Holloway open, when the facade would shatter and he would be forced to face everything he had tried to hide. Cray stepped forward. You're done. There's no more running. Holloway looked at him, then at Miss Marple, his eyes cold once more. You don't understand, he said, his voice low, filled with a quiet venom. You think I'm the only one with blood on their hands. You think you've won. The past will always be there, no matter how hard you try to bury it. With that, Holloway turned and made for the door, but Miss Marple's voice stopped him cold. No, Michael. It's already too late. Truth is out now, and it's you who will be buried by it. For a moment Holloway hesitated, then with a final glance, he stepped into the night, leaving behind the consequences of a lifetime spent running from himself. The game was over, but Miss Marple knew that the scars of his choices would haunt him forever, no matter how far he ran. The quiet that followed Holloway's departure was almost suffocating. The air felt thick with finality, as though the case had finally reached its end. The village, once so full of whispers and tension, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the closure that everyone had expected. But Miss Marple remained unmoved by the stillness around her. She could feel it in her bones, the nagging sense that something still lingered, something just out of reach. Cray, for all his attempts to maintain control of the situation, couldn't mask the relief on his face. "It's over," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "Finally." Miss Marple said nothing at first, her gaze steady on the empty space where Holloway had stood moments before. The moment he had left, she knew it wasn't over. Not yet. She had seen men like him before, driven by fear, by guilt, by the need to hide something even deeper than the crimes they committed. Holloway might have confessed to his part in the murders, but Miss Marple understood one undeniable truth. He wasn't the only player in this game. The room remained silent except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Cray took a step toward the window, his back to her, still processing the weight of Holloway's words. He turned to look at her, a weary frown creasing his brow. "You're still not convinced, are you?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Instead, she picked up the glass of water beside her, swirling it absent-mindedly. "There's more to this than we've seen," she said finally, her voice quiet but unwavering. "The truth isn't as simple as Holloway's confession. There's someone else involved, someone who hasn't yet shown their hand." Cray scoffed, but there was uncertainty in his eyes. "We've got Holloway in custody. The evidence is all pointing toward him. What else is there?" Miss Marple set the glass down gently. "We miss something, Cray. We've been so focused on the obvious suspect, the man with the most to lose, that we failed to look at who stood to gain the most by keeping things hidden." Cray's brow furrowed, and he stepped closer, his voice lowering. "What do you mean?" She leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Eleanor Dorsey," she said simply. Cray blinked. "Eleanor? You think she's involved?" "Not directly," Miss Marple replied, "but I believe she's more connected to this than anyone realizes. She was too quick to believe Holloway's story, too willing to ignore the inconsistencies, the strange moments that didn't add up." Cray shook his head, disbelief creeping into his voice. "But she was the victim, Miss Marple. She was manipulated, lied to, made to believe her husband was someone else. How could she possibly be part of this?" Miss Marple stood up slowly, her eyes still fixed on Cray. "Because Eleanor had something to protect, something Holloway didn't take into account. She had something he needed to keep buried. The question is, why would a woman who was so obviously fooled by Holloway suddenly become so adamant about protecting him, even when the evidence was right in front of her?" Cray's face grew pale. "Are you suggesting she helped him all along? That she's been complicit in the murders?" Miss Marple didn't answer immediately, but her gaze lingered, piercing, as if trying to see into Cray's thoughts. "Not directly, but Eleanor might have played a crucial role in keeping the truth buried. She knew things that could have exposed Holloway, but she never pushed. She allowed herself to be manipulated." Cray was silent for a moment, his thoughts racing. He turned toward the door. I'll need to question her again. But this time, before he could finish, a loud knock echoed from the front of the cottage. Both Cray and Miss Marple exchanged a glance, and without another word, Cray moved to answer the door. When he returned, his face had drained of colour. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice shaky. "There's been another murder. Eleanor, she's gone." A cold wave washed over Miss Marple as the full realization hit her. She had been right. Holloway wasn't the only one playing this game. Someone had been pulling the strings behind the scenes all along, someone who had waited patiently for the right moment to strike. She rose from her seat, her mind racing. Where is she? How did it happen? "It was in the study," Cray replied, his voice low. "She was stabbed. There was no sign of a struggle, but everything was ransacked. Someone wanted to make sure she didn't leave anything behind." Miss Marple's thoughts snapped into place. "It wasn't Holloway," she murmured, almost to herself. "He couldn't have killed her. He wasn't here." Cray stared at her, confused. "What do you mean?" "He could have—" "No," Miss Marple interrupted, her mind racing. "Holloway was never the true mastermind. He was just a pawn. The real killer, the one who made sure the secrets stayed buried, was someone else. Someone who had everything to gain by keeping Eleanor silent." Cray's eyes widened as the truth hit him. "You think she was killed because she knew something? Something too dangerous for the killer to let out?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. Eleanor had been the key all along. She knew about the fraud, the deception, the past. But more importantly, she knew how Holloway had been hiding behind the faces of men who no longer existed. She was too close to the truth, and whoever killed her knew that. Cray was already pulling on his coat, urgency creeping into his movements. Who would do this? "Someone who has been watching us all along," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice steady. "Someone who's been controlling this whole narrative from the shadows." As they made their way toward the crime scene, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that they were still too far behind. The killer had been steps ahead of them from the start, using their own assumptions against them. But now, with Eleanor's death, Miss Marple understood the final piece of the puzzle, and somewhere in the distance, the final reveal awaited. Whoever had orchestrated this entire charade wasn't done yet, and Miss Marple had one final task to complete: to expose the true villain before they could vanish for good. The sun was setting as Cray and Miss Marple arrived at the scene of Eleanor's murder. The study, once a place of quiet reflection and the sharp scent of old leather-bound books, now stood as a testament to a life violently snuffed out. The room was eerily undisturbed, except for the blood-stained carpet and the scattered papers that had once held Eleanor's secrets. There was no sign of forced entry, no indication that she had tried to fight off her assailant. The murderer had been in and out, swift, deliberate. Cray, standing at the door, his hand on the frame, looked like a man who had just discovered the ground beneath him was crumbling. He wasn't looking at the scene. He was looking at Miss Marple, waiting for her to speak, waiting for her to unravel the final strands of the web they had been chasing. "She knew something," Miss Marple murmured as though to herself. "Eleanor was the key all along. She knew the truth. And it's why she had to die." Cray turned to her. "But she was just a victim, a pawn. Holloway killed her, didn't he?" Miss Marple shook her head slowly, her sharp eyes narrowing. No, Cray. Holloway wasn't the killer. He was the decoy. The murderer was someone much closer, to Eleanor, someone who stood to lose everything when the truth came out. The full weight of Miss Marple's words hit Cray like a punch. He stared at her, struggling to process the enormity of what she was saying. Who? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Who would kill to keep the truth hidden? Miss Marple turned, back to the room, her gaze sweeping over the study with the practiced eye of someone who had seen every piece of a puzzle before it had been put together. The scattered papers, the books knocked off their shelves, the open window that let in the evening chill. They were all part of the same game. It's all here, she said softly, in plain sight. Cray stepped forward, his eyes darting between the room and Miss Marple. He didn't understand. What had he missed? Look at the desk, Miss Marple said, pointing. Do you see it? The letter under the lamp. It's signed, but the signature is different. It's the name of someone who was never mentioned, until now. Cray moved to the desk, kneeling to examine the letter. It was short, hurried, but the name at the bottom stood out, R. Westbrook. He looked back at Miss Marple, confusion deepening. Who is this? Why didn't we find this before? Miss Marple sighed, her face softening with the realization. Because we were too focused on Holloway, Cray. We didn't see the true mastermind because we were looking at the wrong man. Eleanor wasn't just a pawn, she was the player who had all the pieces. Cray's breath caught in his throat. Eleanor? She was behind it all? Miss Marple nodded, her voice steady but tinged with sorrow. Not exactly, but she knew. She knew about the fraud, the deception, and the people who had been pulling the strings all along. The real danger wasn't Holloway. It was someone far closer to her, someone she trusted. R. Westbrook was a name that never came up before because it was hidden. But it was always there, lingering in the background, waiting for the right moment. But Eleanor, Cray began, his thoughts racing. How could she? Miss Marple raised a hand, cutting him off gently. Eleanor was never truly fooled by Holloway. She knew something wasn't right, and when she started to ask questions, she was threatened. But instead of backing down, she started to dig deeper. She wasn't just trying to protect her life, her future. She was trying to protect someone else. And that someone is who really killed her. The weight of her words settled between them. Cray's mind was reeling, but something clicked. R. Westbrook. That's it, isn't it? It was Eleanor's own family, wasn't it? She knew the connection all along, but she couldn't expose them. So she kept quiet, even when the truth was right in front of her. Miss Marple looked at him, a small, sad smile crossing her lips. Exactly. Eleanor's father, Ralph Westbrook. He was the one pulling the strings from the shadows, using her to keep things in place. She had to do everything she could to protect him, even if it meant burying the truth. But when Holloway returned, threatening to expose everything, she realized that the past was more dangerous than ever. And in trying to keep it hidden, she sealed her own fate. Westbrook, Cray muttered. It all makes sense now. He was the one. Who got away with it? He was the one who used everyone. Holloway, Eleanor. And now he's free. Miss Marple nodded slowly. But not for long. The truth always finds its way to the surface, Cray. It's just a matter of time. And now, Westbrook is trapped. We have enough to bring him in. Cray looked around the room, his mind still racing. So it's over then? We can arrest him? Miss Marple's expression hardened, her voice quiet but firm. Not yet. There's one more thing you don't know, Cray. Westbrook is not the only one involved in this web of deceit. We've overlooked something crucial, something even more dangerous than Holloway and Westbrook combined. Cray's eyes widened. What are you talking about? Miss Marple hesitated, her gaze shifting to the window. Holloway was right about one thing. He wasn't the only one who had to be silenced. The real mastermind has been one step ahead of us all along, and now they're about to make their final move. Cray's heart skipped a beat. You're saying there's someone else involved? Someone we haven't caught yet? Miss Marple nodded grimly. Exactly. And if we don't stop them now, it will be too late. Just then, a sharp knock interrupted them. Cray rushed to the door, his hand tightening on his gun, ready for whatever came next. As he opened the door, his breath caught in his throat. There, standing in the doorway, was Westbrook, and behind him Eleanor's father, more alive than Miss Marple had anticipated. Miss Marple, he said coldly, his smile twisted with malice. You thought you had it all figured out, but there's still one more surprise waiting for you. Westbrook stood in the doorway, his posture straight and unyielding, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. Behind him the room seemed colder, darker, as if the weight of his presence had already shifted the atmosphere. Miss Marple, standing motionless in the center of the room, could feel the air growing heavier. Cray, beside her, was visibly tense, his hand instinctively reaching toward his coat as if expecting something, though neither of them had drawn a weapon yet. Westbrook didn't look like the cornered man. He looked like someone who knew the game wasn't over yet. You've done well, Miss Marple, Westbrook said, his voice smooth and calculated, like the voice of a man who had never known defeat. But you've missed something. Something vital. Cray took a step forward, his eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? We know what you've done. The murders, the manipulation. It's all coming to an end. Westbrook's eyes flickered, but the smirk never faded. You've caught me in a game of secrets, Inspector. But there's still more to the story, more than you've uncovered. He glanced briefly at Miss Marple. And more than I think you'll ever understand. Miss Marple didn't flinch. She hadn't moved since the door had opened, her calm demeanor betraying nothing of the sudden spike in tension. I don't think it's over yet, Mr. Westbrook. You've been playing a dangerous game, but it's a game that has too many pieces left unturned. You've always been ahead of everyone, haven't you, Miss Marple? Westbrook chuckled, softly, his gaze shifting between her and Cray. But even you couldn't see the full picture. Not all of the pieces are where you think they are. The finality in his words echoed through the room, but there was something in Miss Marple's eyes that told Westbrook he had underestimated her. She had known from the beginning that something wasn't adding up, that there were too many inconsistencies, too many questions that no one had answered fully. Holloway had been the first piece, but he hadn't been the end. And now Westbrook was here, and it seemed he was the last person to make the final move. I think you've made a mistake, Mr. Westbrook, Miss Marple said, her voice steady and composed, despite the heavy silence that lingered between them. The game isn't over. It was never just about you, or Holloway, or any of the names you tried to use to hide your past. Westbrook's eyes hardened, the casual arrogance beginning to fade. You've uncovered the crimes, he said, his voice sharp. But you failed to understand the truth behind it. The truth that you, like everyone else, are just part of a much larger game. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. A game? A game that ends with murder? With destruction? Westbrook's expression softened for just a moment, a flicker of something else in his eyes, something that Miss Marple didn't quite recognize. Don't you see? It was never about just me. It was never about Holloway. It's about control, power, keeping the pieces where I want them, manipulating the rules until the story bends to my will. He paused, and his gaze flicked briefly to the window. I've learned one thing in my life, Miss Marple. You can erase everything. You can control everything. But there's always something left behind. Something small. Something unimportant that people overlook. And that's where the true power lies. The silence in the room thickened. Cray took a step back, his mind racing, but Miss Marple remained where she was, watching Westbrook with the calm intensity that had always been her trademark. She knew he was trying to make her see something, a connection, a pattern. But what? Was it something left behind? Miss Marple repeated softly. You think you've controlled everything, Mr. Westbrook. But the truth isn't in what you've hidden. It's in what you've allowed to slip through your fingers. Westbrook's smirk returned, but there was a nervous edge to it now. You think you know everything. You think you've solved it all. But there's more to this than just your little village, your small investigation. There's a wider world out there, and you've only seen a tiny fraction of it. Cray shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Miss Marple. The tension in the room was nearly unbearable, and he was struggling to make sense of Westbrook's cryptic words. But Miss Marple, as always, had seen through the layers, and she wasn't looking for closure. She was looking for the moment where the final truth would be revealed, where the one last piece, the hidden clue, would make sense. There's something. You're not telling me, Mr. Westbrook, Miss Marple said, her voice low. Something you've been holding on to. Something that explains why you went to such extremes. You thought you could control everything. You thought you could pull the strings of this entire village, but you overlooked one thing. Westbrook stepped back, his face suddenly clouded with suspicion. What are you talking about? Miss Marple's eyes flickered to the window, to the trees outside, to the faint movement in the distance. The truth isn't in the grand scheme. It's in the small things, the things people overlook, the little details that don't fit. And in that, you've made your fatal mistake. For a long moment there was silence. Then, just as Miss Marple was about to say more, a sharp noise, too sudden, too jarring, came from the hallway. Cray's hand shot to his side, instinctively reaching for his weapon, but before he could make a move, the door burst open. Another figure entered the room. It was Eleanor, but it wasn't the same Eleanor who had been here just hours before. Her face was pale, her hands trembling, and there was a haunted look in her eyes that Miss Marple hadn't seen before. Eleanor? Miss Marple asked, her voice cautious but filled with a new understanding. What are you doing here? Eleanor stepped into the room, her gaze flicking between Westbrook and Miss Marple. You were right, she said, her voice trembling but steady. It was never over, and it isn't about me. It was about him, about controlling me. But I couldn't let him anymore. Westbrook's face twisted into an expression of fury. But Miss Marple remained calm, watching Eleanor with a growing sense of clarity. What are you saying, Eleanor? She asked gently. Eleanor swallowed hard, her breath coming in ragged bursts. I had to help him. I thought I could protect him. But I couldn't. He wasn't going to let me go. He was never going to let anyone go. And when I tried to get out, I couldn't. He'd already made his move. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice calm. The truth was always in front of us, Eleanor. You didn't just help him. You were helping yourself, too. You thought you could fix the past, control the story. But in the end, the past doesn't need fixing. It just needs to be seen for what it is. Eleanor's face crumpled as she finally broke down, her sobs muffled by the stillness of the room. The air felt heavy with the weight of everything she had kept hidden, but Miss Marple knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. The case was far from closed. The truth had been uncovered, but it left more questions than answers. And as Miss Marple watched the pieces of the puzzle fall into place, one last question lingered in her mind. How far would someone go to rewrite their own history? Would they ever truly stop? As Eleanor wept in the corner, Miss Marple knew that the answers weren't as simple as they had seemed. The truth had been revealed, but like every mystery, there was always something left beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. And as she stepped away from the room, she felt the faintest stir of anticipation, knowing that this case might be over. But another was always just beyond the horizon. A mystery never ends. It only pauses, waiting for the next twist to emerge.